Welcome back to the recorded music stream. This is Module 3E, Understanding Independent Labels. So when we talk about an independent label or an indie, it could be defined as a label that operates without the funding of or outside major labels. And you will of course recall that in the last module we looked at the major label landscape. That definition of indie is a fairly broad definition and not really even an accurate one. In today's landscape, the majors will invest, either directly or indirectly, in a number of different ways in what's known as an independent release, and in return will receive a variety of rights. So the definition of what truly is an indie label these days is fairly blurred. Michael Gudinski, the operator of the Mushroom Group of companies, which was clearly regarded as Australia's biggest independent label for a long time, always had an association with major labels, whether it be in terms of distribution or some other form of business relationship. So he's well qualified to talk about this meaning of the word independent. He says this: "There are independents and there are independents. There are people who are independent, but they are relying on money from a major. And then there are those who are truly independent using their own money. Then there are people who are scraping together money and it's week to week to feed yourself. When you are independent, you've got the liberty of being a lot more of a leader." And that's an interesting viewpoint that Michael has. And I can assure you that over the journey, he has been in all three of those situations. Struggling to make ends meet, operating in a completely self-sustaining way, and working successfully in a relationship with a major label. Many independents use the distribution services of majors because, of course, it's only the majors or separate independent distribution companies that have the resources to operate a full distribution network, or at least a full physical distribution network. So by that definition, an independent could include companies that have multi-million-dollar turnover, companies such as Ministry of Sound, the Beggars Group or BMG, all the way through to one-person operations, releasing a handful of recordings from kitchen table offices. So when we talk about the indie record label scene, we're really talking about businesses that are vastly different in scale and operation from each other. Australia has always had a long history of creative, resilient and influential independent record companies. Looking back to the 60s and 70s, labels like Fable and of course Mushroom, Sydney labels like Regular and Ruart in the 80s and 90s, and in more recent times, labels like 11, Modular, Due Process. We've always had strong Australian independence, and they've been a very appealing destination for artists and managers in the Australian landscape. It continues on today. There's newer labels, relatively newer labels like Unified, Remote Control, Future Classic, Golden Era, One Love, Mistletoe, Rice is Nice and IOU, amongst many others, that are certainly continuing the tradition of great Australian independent record labels. Interestingly, and perhaps obviously, there are no prerequisites for starting an independent label. You don't have to get a license to operate a label. You don't have to have a certain amount of money in the bank to start an independent record label. And people have started labels literally with next to nothing to their name, operating literally on the smell of an oily rag. In the digital age, these financial barriers to entry are even smaller. You don't even need to have the funding to manufacture CDs if you don't want to. And so an indie label with digital distribution can be as small and as lowly capitalised as it wants to be. But equally, its size is only limited by the ambition and the talent of those operating the business. Nick O'Byrne is the former director of AIR. AIR is the peak body that represents independent record labels in Australia. Nick, of course, has gone on to great success managing Courtney Barnett after his days at AIR, and is now also the programmer of the Big Sound Conference. So Nick's in a pretty good position to talk about the nature of independent labels. If you go out there and you have some nous and you have some taste and you have some conviction, you can build something that starts to get people's attention. What we found with a lot of AIR members is that they have learned their business through instinct and by doing it, and the technicalities come a bit later on. That's not a bad way of going about it, but at the same time, you don't want to be naive and be caught with a whole bunch of costs that you are not ready for. Very wise words from Nick O'Byrne. Realistically, in the early days of an indie label, most of those businesses are not able to support their owners, let alone employ other staff to assist with the company. And generally, they are a labour of love. Most people operating indie labels tend to need to have a day job to allow that indie label to continue to operate almost as a hobby business. Nathan McClay is hugely successful now with his label Future Classic. He knows the early days of operating an indie label very well. For nearly the first 5 years of Future Classic, I was working at Inertia for a day job while DJing a couple of times a week. In close to 10 years, there's been a lot of hard work combined with a DIY mentality about asking questions and trying things to learn how they work, getting inside projects, be they A&R or running a tour or event. And again, that's a pretty accurate reflection of what the early days of an indie label is all about. There's a lot of trial and error generally in such a business. Most small indie labels are not normally started because someone woke up one morning and said they have a passion for administration, small business accounting, and contract negotiations. If you had those passions, starting an independent record label is probably not the best way to funnel that enthusiasm. Most indie labels are started because the owner or the operator of that label has a passion for music, but they have to accept that a passion for music is not going to be enough to allow that label to be sustainable. Those details in the administration, contract, and small business accounting areas are as important in a lot of ways as the ability to uncover cool music, or at least music that you personally think is cool. Joe Alexander runs a great indie label called Bedroom Suck, and he is aware of the importance of the business and administration side, even with a small label. For me, the business side of things is more of a challenge. I feel like I've got a good handle on the creative side. But as you get into running your own small business, the day-to-day stuff is a bit of a burden. But I worry more about the marketing side and how to get the music out there and get people to pay attention. At a label of our size, you do become label, manager, booking agent, producer. You do everything, which is great, but it can be detrimental if you can't get it all done in the way it should be done. And that's another great insight into operating an indie label, that you inevitably end up multitasking. And when you multitask in any industry, there is a risk that you're not going to do some of those jobs as well as they need to be done. Operating an indie label is undoubtedly an exciting journey, but it's an interesting journey in that very rarely is the destination clear. Does the owner of an indie label simply want to be able to create a lifestyle for themselves so that they're able to pay their rent, put food on the table, and go to work every day doing something that they love? Or are they trying to build a business that may have assets, most notably IP assets, that somebody else is going to come along and want to buy from them at some point in the future? Looking back at Michael Gudinski, of course, with Mushroom Records, he did end up selling the company to none other than Rupert Murdoch, which I'm sure was a happy day in the Gudinski household. But equally, Michael will tell you that was not the game plan at the beginning of Mushroom Records. He certainly wasn't looking that far ahead. And that's the case with most indie labels. Very few people start indie labels with a grand plan of signing a certain number of artists, selling a certain number of records, and having a major come along waving a checkbook at them. Sometimes that happens, but it's not necessarily something you can plan for. Michael Parisi has been for many years now one of Australia's leading A&R people, and in that capacity he started several independent labels. He realises that working with a major in some capacity is going to benefit his independent label. He explains it like this. My intention was always to do something with a major because they have the muscle. Working with a major allows a small operation like mine to utilise a team of 65 people in Australia alone. The end game for an independent is to either have a massive hit that keeps you in business for the next 10 years, or you get to the point of finding a partner who might potentially buy you out in the end. And that's a fairly realistic assessment, that unless you are prepared to run your indie label indefinitely as a labour of love or as a hobby, you need at some point in time to either sell a lot of records that subsidises the releases that don't sell so many, or you need to find a way of linking up with a larger company that can provide the funding and infrastructure that you need to take the label forward. So in this fairly brief overview of indie label operations, I hope the following points have resonated with you. The definition of indie label could range from a home office single-person operation to a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Certainly don't be fooled into believing that indie labels are all tiny boutique operations. You can have some very large independents, depending on how you want to define independent. In the world of the long tail, where large numbers of artists are able to release music, indie labels are increasingly important. But the fact is, they've always been important, certainly around the globe, but particularly in the Australian market, where we've had an amazing tradition of indie label operations. Most indie labels are driven by passion, but they must still operate as a business, or they will quickly fall by the wayside. And finally, operating an indie label is a great learning experience because you are generally exposed to every single step of the process of releasing music. It's possible in a major label to be compartmentalised within a particular area and not really be exposed to what everyone else in the building might be doing. In an indie label, everyone multitasks and everyone finds themselves pretty much across the entire process of releasing music. And that makes indie labels certainly a really fun part of the broader recorded music industry. I hope you got something valuable out of this module.